I'd like to begin here historically by noting that the biosphere concept was coined and defined by Edward Seuss, I suppose you would pronounce it, in 1875, simply as the place on Earth's surface where life dwells. For Seuss, the biosphere was just an incidental factor in his characterization of planet Earth as a series of concentric spheres, the lithosphere, the baryosphere as he called it, and the atmosphere being the sort of primary physical states. And the biosphere was just a thin film of living organisms at the interface of these three main geospheres, and was basically sort of adapted to these pre-existing conditions. Vladimir Vernadsky transformed Seuss's concept of biosphere in a book titled The Biosphere, which was published in Russian in 1926. It was based on lectures he gave in Paris in 1922. It's not clear to me in what language he was lecturing, but in any case, the book was published in Russian, and then it was published in French translation in 1999, and it was only in the 1980s, in 1929, it was only in the 1980s that a translation, sort of the biosphere appeared in English. And it was done on the basis of the French translation of the original Russian, and it was, in Lynn Margulis's words, a Baudelarized version. It's clear to me that, and Dorian could confirm this or not, that Lynn Margulis actually wrote the foreword. There were 12 co-authors, but her inimitable style is unmistakable, and her contempt for the red-suited biospherians of Biosphere 2 is palpable. And when she asked the editor-in-chief, Tango Snyder Parrish, why the book was so thin, she replied that she had removed everything that was wrong, which Margulis goes on to condemn as unconscionable mangling, and I would add eviscerating and mutilating as well. So, and if you read the Biosphere in English translation, as it was written in 1926, there is a lot of stuff in it that is wrong. For example, Vernadsky claims that solar radiation has remained constant while it has increased over time. His calculation of the quantity of oxygen in the atmosphere is off by about 3 orders of magnitude, and he did not seem to realize that the Earth's atmosphere was oxygen poor for a long time, and that the oxygen-rich atmosphere was poisonous to early life. What is really wrong, or very strange, about Vernadsky's notions here is that he insisted on the abiogenesis of life. He thought that the Earth was always colonized by living matter, and that living matter existed from all eternity, co-equal and co-evil with inert matter. So he began by regarding the Earth in, I guess, Aristotelian fashion as just always having been here and always occupied by life. Then when he was forced by the evidence to give that up, he adopted the panspermia idea in which living matter arrived on Earth from outer space, and from time immemorial it had existed cosmically. So he had a steady state view of the cosmos. So it's really no hyperbole to say that Vernadsky was life intoxicated. And I think that what he got right is far more significant than what he got wrong. Seuss's Biosphere was the passive beneficiary of the fortuitous Goldilocks conditions on the Earth. Vernadsky's Biosphere was the active creator of many of those conditions. If life, or as he preferred to think of it as living matter, is not an internal cosmic force, it is certainly a geological force transforming not only the chemistry of the atmosphere and the hydrosphere, but also both the chemical composition and physical structure of the lithosphere. According to Margulis's foreword, quote, life is not merely a geological force, it is the geological force at Earth's surface. And so in terms of its effect on the lithosphere, particularly, obviously, limestone, travertine, and marble are biogenic. Prior to the advent of life on Earth, according to a recent paper, there were about 1,500 mineral species. Post-life, 4,300, and so 3,600 are biogenic. The force of life may even determine, and I spoke with Lynn about this at a previous meeting, a Gaia meeting, that may even determine the granitic crustal chemistry and drive plate tectonics on Earth via sedimentation and subduction. As Vernadsky himself notes, the ocean floor receives millions of tons per year of calcium and magnesium carbonates, limestones and dolomites, silica, opals, hydrated iron oxides, lamanites, hydrated manganese compounds, pyrolusite and silymalane complex phosphates of calcium, and all of these are biogenic. So, as I mentioned, Vernadsky prefers the term living matter to life, and thus he was a dualist, but not the typical Cartesian mind, body, or soul matter dualist, but really a matter-matter dualist. And I'm wondering if this might be, to some extent, consistent with his with the materialism of the Soviet Union. He seemed to have been, though not a political person himself, nevertheless a loyal citizen of the Soviet Union and involved in their nuclear program. Vernadsky, not only did he think that living matter was co-equal and co-evil with inert matter, he also, and this is another very strange sort of quasi-scientific, quasi-metaphysical doctrine, thought that it occupied a separate space characterized by a local Riemannian geometry. Not that Riemannian geometry, according to Einstein, characterizes the cosmos as a whole, but Vernadsky argues that, in a sense, it is the space of living matter. He also makes a great deal of the fact that living matter is handed, left and right-handed, as you were pointing out earlier this morning. So it's both curvilinear and asymmetrical, and only atoms cross membranes and the geometrical boundary separating living matter from inert matter. The primary function of living matter is to colonize inert matter and transform it into itself. So, classically, life, I think, had been understood to be characterized by an internal teleology, by an Aristotelian efficient and moving cause and a final cause. The efficient cause was a horme in Greek, or conatus in Latin, a striving toward a telos, or goal. Hobbes's endeavor, Schopenhauer's will, would be philosophical or metaphysical expressions of this. Vernadsky, on the other hand, understood that life was a planetary phenomenon, the character of the planet as a whole, not of organisms severally, and he understood life primarily in thermodynamic terms. And I found it interesting to learn today that possibly the earliest life was from geothermal vents. So the thermodynamic concept nevertheless would apply to that, though Vernadsky was not aware of those and considered solar energy to be the primary driving force of living matter. In his view, living matter uses radiant solar energy to organize elements drawn from the domain of inert matter into complex compounds that represent potential chemical energy, and radiant solar energy is also converted into mechanical winds and currents and thermal energy. So, this a quotation from the Biosphere. The Biosphere is at least as much a creation of the sun as a result of terrestrial processes. The action of solar radiation on Earth processes provides a precise basis for viewing the Biosphere as both a terrestrial and a cosmic mechanism. The sun has completely transformed the face of the Earth by penetrating the Biosphere, which has changed the history and destiny of our planet by converting rays from the sun into new and varied forms of energy. At the same time, the Biosphere is largely a product of this radiation. By way of contrast, Henri Bergson, a contemporary of Vernadsky's, was really essentially perpetuating the ancient Horme or commodus conception of life by positing this mystical élan vital to oppose thermodynamic entropy and thus account for biological organization. So Vernadsky more subtly understood biological organization or neg entropy in purely thermodynamic terms. Now, moving from the Biosphere to the Noosphere, Vernadsky wrote a work in English that was called the Biosphere and the Noosphere. So it's interesting, I think, also to see what this concept was and what its historical origins are. The word noosphere does not appear in the Biosphere. It was coined by Edouard Leroy, who was an associate and actually a disciple of Bergson, and developed by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and both were devout but speculative Catholics. Teilhard's concept of the noosphere is conventionally dualistic. All matter, in Teilhard's view, down to atoms, is ensouled and minimally conscious. Evolution is teleological and ends at an omega point at which mind is liberated altogether from matter. Self-reflective human consciousness is at the anti-penultimate stage of cosmic evolution. The penultimate stage will be reached when human consciousness coalesces and integrates into a kind of unified planetary consciousness. And the ultimate stage, the omega point, is pure cosmic consciousness or spirit, when spirit or mind has been liberated altogether from its being sullied with matter. And I think that there are, I mentioned Clarke's noosphere here, but not Bruno's. This is Arthur C. Clarke in the novel Childhood's End, in which he posits the existence of an overmind, which would be similar to the omega point in that which then both Teilhard and Leroy associated with the Logos and therefore with Christ. So you can see that there was a vast difference between their noosphere and what we'll see about Vernadsky's noosphere. Now, true to his materialism, Vernadsky's noosphere commences with the cephalization of living matter, the evolution of the central nervous system, eventually the human brain, and during Vernadsky's own lifetime, the linking of human brains. And he insists on speaking of human brains here, keeping with his materialism, via communications technologies such as radio and television, informed by science, and a universal planetary epistemology to spontaneously evolve a global minefield. He specifically compares a religious epistemology which is divisive to a scientific epistemology which is unifying, and politicizes this, especially writing in the context as he was of the Second World War, or its aftermath, that this more unified conception of humankind and of the unifying sense of scientific epistemology ultimately triumphs over the divisive epistemologies of nationalism and religion. Let me see, I lost my place here. The noosphere then is but the latest phase of the evolution of living matter. It's doing what it's always done, which is transforming inert matter and colonizing planet Earth. Man, he writes, under our very eyes is becoming a mighty and ever-growing geologic force. Vernadsky even anticipates the now trendy Anthropocene concept with the term the anthropogenic era. And we are, mankind, Homo sapiens is chemically, the face of our planet, the biosphere, is being changed by man consciously, and he adds, I think, somewhat ominously, and even more so unconsciously. Normally, this particular figure, Aldo Leopold, would not be included in this sort of line of history. I'm including him partly for personal reasons. Aldo Leopold's land ethic has been the subject of a great deal of my own research. I'm convinced that the land ethic, as elegant as it is for our ecologically scaled environmental problems, is not very well scaled to global environmental concerns, especially global climate change. However, in 1923, Leopold wrote a paper that wasn't ever published in his lifetime. It was only published in 1979, called innocuously Some Fundamentals of Conservation in the Southwest, in which he envisioned an Earth ethic. And in the course of speculating on the possibility of an Earth-scaled ethic, he, in the faintest of all sketches, anticipates the Gaia hypothesis. So, to some extent, he was a few years ahead, or just about the same period that Vernadsky was developing the biosphere concept in far more detail than Leopold ever did. But I'd like to sort of include Leopold in this story because he adds the ethical dimension to the Gaia hypothesis. Leopold was influenced, I think regrettably, by another and inferior Russian writer, P.D. Uspensky, in this paper, Some Fundamentals of Conservation in the Southwest. And as I say, Leopold's is a faint sketch, and it appeared in 1979 in the inaugural volume of Environmental Ethics. And that is interesting because it was the same year in which Gaia, a new look at life on Earth by Lovelock appeared. Typically for Leopold, the idea of a living planet is related to the possibility of an environmental ethic. So this is what Leopold says in Some Fundamentals of Conservation in the Southwest. It is at least not impossible to regard the Earth's parts, soil, mountains, rivers, atmosphere, etc., as organs or parts of organs of a coordinated whole, each part with a definite function. And if we could see this whole, as a whole, through a great period of time, we might perceive not only organs with coordinated functions, but possibly also that process of consumption and replacement which in biology we call metabolism or growth. In such a case, we would have all the visible attributes of a living thing, which we do not now recognize to be such because it is too big and its process is too slow. And there would also follow that invisible attribute, a soul or consciousness, which many philosophers of all ages ascribe to all living things and aggregations thereof, including the dead earth. Going on, the next paragraph. There is not much discrepancy, except in language, between this conception of living earth and the conception of a dead earth with enormously slow, intricate, and interrelated functions among its parts, as given us by physics, chemistry, and geology. The essential thing for present purposes is that both admit the interdependent functions of the elements. Possibly in our intuitive perceptions, which may be truer than our science, and less impeded by words than our philosophies, we realize the indivisibility of the earth, its soil, mountains, rivers, forests, climate, plants, animals, and respect it collectively, not only as a useful servant, not only from the utilitarian perspective, but a living being vastly less alive than ourselves in degree, but vastly greater than ourselves in time and space. A being that was old when the morning stars sang together, and when the last of us has been gathered unto his fathers, will still be young. It's powerful prose, isn't it? Now, one of the things that I've recently been doing, because internet searches are so easy, is to copy in phrases here and see what the allusions are. When the morning stars sang together is biblical, as is the last of us has been gathered unto our fathers, two different places. I think one is Job and the other is Kings or something like that. So the ability to draw on the rhetoric of biblical phrasing in order to express new ideas enables him to do so with a kind of persuasiveness that most of us prosaic scholars unfortunately lack. Okay, so let me compare Vernadsky's and Leopold's biosphere and noosphere concepts. I think for both Leopold and Vernadsky, they view the planet as a single living whole, the essence of which is metabolism. For Vernadsky, that metabolism is the transformation of inert matter into living matter, radiant energy into other forms of energy, biogenic minerals in the face of the earth. For Leopold, he just mentions metabolism, doesn't really specify it. I mean, his, like I say, his is a faint sketch. Vernadsky recognizes that living matter is a geological force. I don't think Leopold does so much. But Leopold suggests something that is less well developed in Vernadsky, and that is that there is a planetary physiology, Earth's parts as organs, each part with a definite function and coordinated functions of the parts, which is, will, I think, eventually manifest itself as the basis of a more cybernetic and regulatory feature of Gaia theory. And Leopold's noosphere is probably, and we only speculate about this because he doesn't elaborate, an epiphenomenal or emergent consciousness on a planetary scale, whereas Vernadsky's is an emergent global communications network generating a collective epistemology and a universal body of knowledge, much more pedestrian in the case of Vernadsky. Okay, so all of this was pretty much European until, as I put it here, the biosphere crosses the Atlantic. Now, this takes advantage of fortuitous coincidence. Vernadsky's son, George, was a professor of Russian history at Yale University, and he introduced his father's work to G. Evelyn Hutchinson, arguably probably the most creative ecologist of his day. Hutchinson facilitated the publication in English of 2 synoptic works by the elder Vernadsky, Problems of Biogeochemistry 2. I don't know what happened to 1, but 2 is all we have by Vernadsky in 1944, in which that's the place where Vernadsky expounds, among other things, his theory of the Riemannian asymmetrical geometry of living matter. And the other publication is called Biosphere and the Noosphere. And immediately, Hutchinson himself began publishing papers on biogeochemistry and the chemistry of the atmosphere and the ocean. So I think that there was a direct influence of Vernadsky's work on Hutchinson. In 1948, Hutchinson published a paper titled On Living in the Biosphere. His 1954 paper, Biogeochemistry of the Terrestrial Atmosphere, was cited by Lovelock in his very first essay, a short letter with the word Gaia in title. So the biosphere landed in North America during the heyday of ecosystem ecology, which was initiated by Arthur Tansley in 1935 and completed by Raymond Lindemann in 1942, and then institutionalized, so to speak, by E.P. Odom in the 1950s with his then unique, I mean, it was the only textbook in ecology called Fundamentals of Ecology. It lasted as the primary text there for 3 decades, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And ecosystem ecology was all about material cycling and energy flows as it had been synthesized and organized by Odom. So Vernadsky's biosphere featured energy flow, but more from the perspective of the transformation of radiant solar energy into mechanical, thermal, and especially potential chemical energy than of transmission up food chains. And Vernadsky's biosphere featured materials transformation from inert matter to living matter, and from living matter to novel biogenic inert matter, but he wasn't so interested in these nutrient cycles that the ecosystem ecologists were. So consistent with the state of the art of ecosystem ecology, Hutchinson's biosphere featured materials cycling, and consistent with nascent post-war environmentalism, man was portrayed as a disruptive force. The biosphere was gloriously revealed as such in 1968 when the crew of the Apollo 8 returned photographs of the Earth taken from the moon in their circumnavigation, and then more followed with Apollo 10 and 11. And so after nearly a quarter century of lying dormant, the biosphere concept was back in vogue, thanks in no small measure to the Apollo project, as generously noted, incidentally, by Marvelous in her 1991 essay, Gaia by Any Other Name. I remember in the 1970s being questioned by liberal colleagues who thought we were wasting all of this money on these goddamn trips to the moon. It could be better spent on social projects in the inner city and that sort of thing. I said, no, it's worth every penny because of the psychological transformation that these photographs produced.